Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be looking at some background information on the technologies used to create web pages. So we're going to start with a few words about the structure. HTML is in charge of the structure of your documents. HTML stands for the Hypertext Markup Language. So the content, the organization of the content of a web page is described through this markup language. The content of every web page is specified using it. Please note this is not a regular programming language. It's a markup language. A notation for specifying how web page information content is organized in terms of paragraphs, tables, lists, etc. Programming languages are going to have things like they will allow you to use with variables, mathematical operators, logic structures like decision statements and loops. Okay, none of that is in here. This is not a programming language. A markup language is really just a set of rules that allows you to specify what is a paragraph, what is a table, what is a list, what's an image, and so on. HTML is an international standard also set forth by the World Wide Web Consortium, the w3c.org, a website that we saw in the previous video. It's the organization that is responsible for the maintenance of and the making of extensions to the HTML standard. HTML and its derivatives can be read and interpreted on any computer, handheld device, or mobile phone. And essentially, what is important about HTML is that it allows you non-linear access through the use of clickable links, or what they call hyperlinks, embedded in the web page text. So you can click on a link and it can jump to another document. That's the big deal about it. That's what's special about it. I did mention in the previous video that this is constantly evolving. Please remember we're currently using HTML 5.2. As they introduce new features, they also deprecate some of the older features that are no longer needed. As we start using the tags of the HTML language, I'm going to point out which ones are new, probably might not exist and may not be interpreted correctly in older browsers, which tags are old and are no longer considered relevant. They still probably work for the most part, but eventually they'll be dropped from HTML, and browsers are going to stop supporting them. And like I said, the markup language is a notation for specifying the layout. That's what they call the markup. Okay, so it's based around the idea that documents have structural and other organizational features that can be described without reference to how such features should be displayed. Okay, the actual display of such a document may vary depending on the output medium and the presentation preferences. Now here's an example of what a document could look like. Okay, it's going to have a structure or organization, and on the next slide we get to identify the individual components of this web page. We got a main topic. The next thing we have is a quotation. So there's a special tag to create quotes inside your text. We got subtopics that we can create with different level headings. We got paragraphs. We got a bulleted list here with a bunch of list items. We got some additional paragraphs. So that's the structure of this document. The most important feature of HTML is the element. They're used to divide the HTML document into parts such as chapters, important sections, less important sections by using different heading levels, paragraphs, lists, tables, images, and so on and so forth. But the HTML element is the building block of the web page. The HTML syntax, okay, the elements use instructions to determine how the page content should be organized on a web page, and HTML tags are used to create these elements. and they're usually used in pairs. So for most elements, we're going to have an opening tag and a closing tag. Not for all of them, but for most of them, we're going to need to open the element by using an opening tag, provide some content, and then we should not forget to close the element by using a closing tag. The element's content is what goes in between those two, the information contained between the two tags. Okay, um, this is a summary of the syntax. We got an opening tag, we got the content, we got a closing tag, and then we should not forget that there are some elements that don't need a closing tag. Now, if you're programming in XHTML, the extensible hypertext markup language, you will be required to always close the tag, the element, by using a slash. We're not going to be doing that in this class. We're using HTML, so this will work, but it's not really necessary. So those elements, such as the break, as in this example here, um, the break is going to cause the cursor to move on to the next line, can be used on its own like so. We don't need to worry about a closing tag. Okay, so we're doing HTML. All right. Uh, your web pages are usually going to be split into two main parts. You got a head section and a body section. The head section is used to contain control information that the browser reads, and then the body section is really what you might want to call the guts of the web page. This is where the content of the web page goes. Okay, this is what needs to be displayed in the browser. So the head section is used to provide some important control information and commands, things like, for example, styling or loading of additional files, um, specifying the title, etc. And then the body section is where all the content of the web page goes. Okay, there's three elements we're going to have in all of our web pages. The HTML element, this is considered to be the root element. Everything is going to be enclosed between the opening and closing HTML tags. Okay, the tags are always going to be, this is mandatory. The angle brackets that you see here, they're part of the syntax. Then we're going to have the head section, heading section, and then we're going to have the body section. These three will be present in all of our web pages. Okay. Some examples here of elements. Well, we just mentioned HTML and head. Title isn't mandatory, but it's really a good idea to have that. This is where you get to specify the title of your web page, and this is what's going to get displayed in the tab of your web page in the browser. So when somebody opens up your web page, that tab in their browser which displays it is going to have that title show up there. I'm going to show you this in just a moment. Headings, we start with heading level 1 and go through, I believe, all the way to 6. So the heading level 1 is the largest, biggest, most important heading, and then heading level 6 is the smallest. It's probably going to be really hard to read on the screen. I encourage you to experiment with these and just get an idea of how headings are displayed by the browser that you're using. Paragraphs allow you to separate text into paragraphs. Unnumbered lists this is how you create bulleted lists, and then numbered list is how you create a numbered list. Okay, each individual item in those lists will be separated from the rest with the help of a li tag. So list item. If you got 5 list items in your list, then you're going to have 5 of these. And then finally, the comments are really just for you, the programmer. This is not going to be displayed on the screen by your browser unless you misspell it, in which case the browser won't understand that you're referring to a comment. But if you spell it correctly, which means you do angle bracket, exclamation point, dash dash, and then you close it with dash dash angle bracket, then this will be just a comment for you and whoever else might need to read your code. So once they open your web page in an editor, this is a way for you to give them some hints as to what exactly is going on with your code. so you're really just leaving comments there, but the browser will be ignoring all of these comments and not displaying them on the screen. A very useful tag, by the way, if you're a programmer. Now, the frequency of HTML elements as they show up in web pages, I just got this off of the web, so it's relatively recent. Um, it's a little bit weird that not all web pages are using the body tag. This is wrong. This is probably just errors. These three need to be present, so they should show up at 100%. And then as you scroll down, you're going to see what other tags people are using. Title, meta is for specifying meta information about your web page, like keywords, for example. Division for identifying entire divisions of your web page. I'm going to show you how this works and why we're going to use it, why we need to use it. A is what we use to create hyperlinks. Script is for embedding little snippets of code. A link is if you want to link to another file and load its contents into your own file. IMG is for loading images, paragraphs, and so on. So we're going to take a look at all of these as we go through the semester. It's really interesting to see tables show up here. It's 1/3 of the web pages online right now are still using tables. As we shall see this term, we generally want to use the new features offered by HTML5 and CSS3 to format our text on the screen and the layout of our text. Back when I was learning about web development, we nearly all the time we were using tables to format our text on the screen. So your tables didn't have any borders, they were invisible, but they allowed you to structure your content the way you wanted to. Now, how many columns do you want, how many rows, and things like that. And your users don't really get to see that there's a table there. It's invisible. It doesn't have a border. And I still love using tables and creating formatting this way. But this is considered to be a deprecated approach, an old approach. And I will show you what they advise we use nowadays. We use CSS and we use HTML5, the newer tags, to help us format the way our pages look. Next thing we see is a template. I do have this saved as an HTML page that you can use inside the week 1 folder. You can download that. If you accidentally forget, how do I start? What tags do I need to create the head, or where do I place the body? You can just download that template and use it. And here is a slightly more complex example, one that has a little bit more text. It's got an ordered list, a list of numbered items down here, a couple of paragraphs, a heading. And in this class, we're going to be using a basic text editor to create our web pages and to create the styling for our web pages. So Notepad on the Windows system is the most common basic text editor. Whoops. I was looking for Notepad. Let me try one more time. There it is. There it is. Okay, what I want to do is I want to try and see if this code works for me. I'm just going to copy the whole thing. One thing I like about Notepad is it just immediately throws away all formatting. Bold, colors, all of that just disappears and everything becomes just plain text, which is precisely what we need here. As far as the indentation goes, this is where you place your instructions. That's really something the browsers will ignore. It's entirely up to you, the programmer, to decide whether you indent your commands and how you do that. Okay, the idea here is that you try and be well organized and that you structure your code in a manner that makes sense to you, that makes it easier for you to read. Okay, it's all considered white space. All these blank lines, the spaces, the tabs, these are all called white spaces and they'll be ignored by the browsers. Okay, so I got the code here. I'm going to go to File, Save As. I want to place this on the desktop so I can easily find it. Now notice this, if you're using a text editor, chances are it may be defaulting to the creation of text documents. Just to be on the safe side, I'm going to switch to all files, and I'm going to give this a name. What was I doing here? Introduction. Okay, I'm going to call this intro dot hdm or html. So I'm making sure it's got the correct extension. And click save and close out of Notepad, minimize this, and there's my newly created file. If I double click on it, I've currently selected Firefox as my favorite browser, but you could test this, and you probably would want to test your work in multiple browsers just to see how it works, how it looks. But it looks like it's working just fine. I can see my content displayed here. If I right click and I go to view page source, I get to see the actual page that is being read by the browser. These line numbers are here just for my information. They're not part of the code. I got heading 1, a couple of paragraphs, and a list of numbered items. All right. A good exercise I'd recommend that you try after this video is to create a small web page like this one, um, but not by copying and pasting the code, but rather by typing it from scratch. And if it doesn't show up properly in the browser, chances are you probably misspelled something somewhere. You might have missed a character, um, so just go back and check and make sure that everything that's supposed to be there is there. And with HTML, the tags or the elements of the commands are not case sensitive. It is, however, strongly you are advised that you spell them all with lowercase letters. Again, it's considered to be a good programming practice. With XHTML, um, you are going to be required to spell everything correctly and with the correct case. But we're not doing XHTML, we're doing HTML, so it's not case sensitive. But like I said, a good programming practice is to make sure your tags are all spelled lowercase letters. All right. So another quick look at how we achieve the structure via markup. You can see here that they've used the heading 1, heading 2, the P tags, UL, LI, and P. Um, let me come back here. One thing I forgot to mention, and it's good to note here, is look at this. Big on Fruits is my title. Okay, when you specify a title, the browser would display that value in the tab up here at the top. It gives you the title of the web page, which is why it's really a good idea to always have a title for your web pages. All right, that takes us to presentation. The second part, the cascading style sheets. Um, we use CSS to achieve all the styling. The original idea, by the way, of HTML was to do everything with just HTML. CSS did not exist, so everything was supposed to be done. All the styling was supposed to be done through HTML code and through a mixture of content and formatting, and it became really um, a mishmash of different instructions that people would use for different things. Some would be for the content, some would be for the formatting. The W3 consortium realized later that this mixing of content and formatting was not a good idea, and so web page content and the formatting part were to be separated. Okay, so they introduced the concept of CSS, cascading style sheets. The idea that formatting and display information, for the most part, is taken out of the body section of the web page and placed inside the head section or even in a separate file as CSS rules is what CSS constitutes. So that's the whole idea. You take out the styling into a separate chunk of code that you can place either normally in the head section of your web page or outside in a separate CSS file, which is also a text file. And again, you're going to use Notepad to create those CSS files too. They're going to have an extension of CSS though. So, what are the style sheets? They define the formatting or the way that the information is displayed. You get to define things like the size of the font, the foreground colors, the background colors. If you want to use any background images, the margins. There's quite a few characteristics that can be tweaked for all the HTML elements with the help of CSS. The CSS, or the style sheets, just give the designer more flexibility in formatting instructions than HTML tags ever did. Um, by allowing the specification of values for quantity such as, for example, line spacing and left and right margins and things like that. They let the designer control layout like never before. So um, that's what we're using today for the formatting. Um, One of the fundamental features of CSS is that the sheets are going to cascade. Okay, I'm going to need to explain this separately in a separate video how this works or in class. Um, but style rules from different style sheets for the same web page are going to be merged, and that's where the name comes from. There's a styling process, there's a cascading process in which different styles are applied based on where they appear. Are they imported from an outside file? Have they been defined in the heading section, or are they inside the element itself? So there's some rules that help you resolve conflicts between the different style sheets, and they're defined in the CSS specification. They're beyond the scope of this video, but we're going to come back to that and we'll talk about those. Here's an example of how CSS rules are created. So this is what a CSS command could look like, if you will. For your paragraphs, how are you setting the styles? In between a set of curly braces, you're telling the browsers, look, I want to use a foreground color red and a background color blue. So every time this browser displays a paragraph in this web page, it's going to try and show its foreground color in red and its background color in blue. There's three ways you can set up your styling. It could be outside of your web page in a separate CSS file. So over here, I don't know if you can see that well. We'll get to do this in class and in multiple exercises. But over here, what we have is a chunk of code that tells us how to format the body of our web pages by specifying the font to be of a certain type and the background to be of certain color. Now, the second type of styling is by creating it or defining it inside the heading section. In this one example, we don't actually have any code. You can see here that's one large comment. But if we take that out, then we'll be defining the styling for all heading ones to be italicized. And then finally, the third approach is to do the styling inside the elements themselves. So here we have a division for which we set the styling to be centered with a width of 70% and a border of 1 pixel. Here's a closer look at that code, so it's easier to see it here. That's our CSS file. It is loaded inside our web page by using the link element. So we've got a link tag here that says I want you to load a web page called Melville CSS, and the relationship to that web page is style sheet, which means there's going to be some style rules that I want you to apply to my web page. That's the second way of creating styles. It's inside the heading. And then the third and final way, it's called inline styling, is where you specify a specific style for an element inside the HTML code itself. All three of these work, and you can combine all three of these. Okay, now we move on to behavior, which refers to the interactivity part of our web pages. Forms were the original way of making web pages interactive. They allowed the user to give us some input to be processed. And like a paper form, you can use a form on a web page to allow the user to enter some requested information and then submit it for processing. You send that input to the web server, which will then process it somehow and return the results to the user in the form of another web page. So HTML forms could include quite a few controls. There's a whole set of these. We'll spend a week on how to create web forms. Could be text boxes, check boxes, radio buttons, clickable buttons, menus. There's a huge slew of such controls that we can use with web forms, and we'll explore them all. Now here's a quick example of a web form. It's a bit old, um, but the setup is similar today as well. Google's website has got one text box in the middle by default. You can change that, I believe, but by default they got one text box in the middle with a couple of clickable buttons at the bottom. So you get to specify what you're looking for here. You click one of these buttons, and then Google servers respond to you in some meaningful manner. Many web pages are interactive in this sense. We don't think much about it, we're used to it, but that's how interactivity is created. So the user's input is compiled, sent to the server, and then on the server side, if everything is properly configured, the server will process that information and respond in a way that you would expect it to. There can be some limited amount of processing taking place on the client side as well. So this is where JavaScript comes in. Um, we can do things like, for example, we can validate the input data with the help of JavaScript. That all happens on the user's computer. You don't need the servers for that. And we'll see some other interesting uses of JavaScript on the client side later in this term. Okay, so the web servers can return either static documents or dynamically created ones. Forms are used for this interactivity, and scripts, for example, JavaScript can be embedded to create some interactivity in the web pages on the client side. Animation in web pages could include quite additional features, and it makes use of dynamic HTML, which is really the whole set of interactive technologies that we can use, and it allows you to react to browser actions such as, for example, clicking a button or just rolling the mouse, which is what I'm doing right now, for example, pressing a key on the keyboard, and the like. The technologies used in website development, here's a few acronyms here. We already know what HTML is and the extensive hypertext markup language. We know CSS, which is the cascading style sheet. We know JavaScript, and we know the hypertext transfer protocol. What is dynamic HTML? This is not a language. Okay, I want to clarify this. Chances are we're not going to be referring to this often in our class, but it's a term, and terminology is important in any beginner level class, so we should make sure we understand all the terms. Dynamic HTML refers to the dynamic part of creating of web pages. Okay, it's a collection of technologies that help you move beyond just a static presentation, and it includes all these languages that allow you to create the whole experience more dynamic for the user. VB script and JavaScript are used on the client side. These scripts are embedded inside the HTML document, so you don't write entire programs. You don't have to. These languages are designed to help you use just short snippets of code to accomplish different tasks. And the dynamic part can be generated both on the client and the server side. So on the server side, there's different technologies that people use, things like Java server pages, active server pages, etc. And then on the client side, we have JavaScript. PHP, that's also an example of a technology that can be used on the server side to do things like, for example, communicate with a database and search a database and produce results. SXHTML, we did look at that. Here's a summary of how it's different. So syntax wise, it's really identical to HTML, but how is it then any different than HTML? Well, the the elements, if you want to be using a XHTML, you want to make sure that everything is properly nested, so no errors are allowed. Um, with XHTML, elements must have a starting and an ending tag. Element names are case sensitive. Attribute values must be enclosed in quotation marks, and attributes may not be repeated. Okay, I really don't want to spend more time with XHTML at this time because this isn't what we're going to be using in this class. So I wanted to make sure you understood the difference between HTML and XHTML, but we're going to stick with the regular HTML. And finally, AJAX is something you may come across. It stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. This is a technology that allows you to refresh just part of a web page. Okay, so it allows you to be more efficient when refreshing a web page. You don't reload the entire web page, only those parts that have changed. So that's the idea behind Ajax. Again, this is well beyond the scope of our class. We're not gonna, there's a separate JavaScript class that you can take where you're gonna learn more about this, but in this class we just want to know what the term stands for and leave it at that. Okay, and that wraps up our discussion on background of web development. Thank you very much for watching.